Cody, some news to start involving Lovie Smith and the Houston Texans. Jeremy Fowler writing earlier today that Houston has become a spot to watch as the coaching carousel nears. Fowler, of course, an ESPN NFL insider. In this piece that airs or that dropped on ESPN.com, it mentions the fact that the Texans have regressed on the field, and should the Texans move on from Lovie Smith, the name to watch for is Eagles defensive coordinator Jonathan Gannon, because Nick Caserio was believed to be very high on him during last year's interview cycle. So we've been hearing the rumblings about Lovie's job status the last couple of weeks. Today's the first time that we have a tangible name associated with who that replacement could be for the Texans.
Nice connection there. One of the finalists from last year. The three finalists were McCown, Gannon, and Brian Flores for the Houston Texans, and Lovie Smith ended up with the job. We all know that that was sort of a unique and weird situation, and it makes sense that Gannon is connected yet again. We talk about DeMeco Ryans and his best defense in football and the best defense when it comes to total defense in football. I'll give you one guess on who the second best defense in football is when it comes to total defense. Ding, ding. It's the Philadelphia Eagles, led by Jonathan Gannon. And they've had to adjust on the fly to a couple of different things. Now, that's a really talented defense. So I'm not going to sit here and act like Jonathan Gannon has schemed up some amazing defensive scheme. Heck, half of Philadelphia was ready to run him out of town last year, and we're unhappy with him. But guys grow, guys evolve, and get a little bit better. That's a name that is going to get connected, and it'll make a lot of sense if Gannon gets back in the mix, and even if he does get the job again, because last year it looked like the Houston Texans were ready to hire a head coach with the staff in place for the head coach. And I don't know that Jonathan Gannon was totally on board with that type of move by the Texans. It looked like Pep Hamilton was going to get promoted. Looked like Lovie Smith was going to be a part of the defensive staff. And it didn't seem like Jonathan Gannon, if he took this job, was going to have a total amount of control that you would hope a head coach has in putting together a staff. Now, again, we all wanted Pep Hamilton to stick around. The vast majority of us felt like he'd earned the opportunity. But if Gannon had wanted to go in a different route, I feel like that could have been one of the hiccups in him ultimately getting the job. Would have been fine with the pivot to him once they said they couldn't hire McCown instead of Lovie Smith. You'd already be a year into the Jonathan Gannon experience. But right now, with basically a clean slate coming in this offseason, Gannon getting a shot to pick all his coaches and put it all together with the help of Nick Caserio, makes a lot of sense that he's involved.
You think the Texans were ever seriously interested in Jonathan Gannon last year, or do you think that was a facade they had put on to make it look like they were going through a real, legitimate coaching search?
I believe there was a moment of panic and pivot when they realized they couldn't hire Josh McCown, and there was a hope that Gannon would take this job, and I don't think it aligned well for either side to have him take that job at that moment. And thus we end up with Lovie Smith.
Yeah, I don't know if Gannon was ever a legitimate candidate for this opening last year. Now, we got interviewed twice, so there was at least some interest there. I can acknowledge that. But we all know the plan was for Josh McCown to be the head coach of the Texans. It didn't feel like he had to interview once to get the job. The Texans wanted to hire him almost regardless of how the interview process went, and it just felt like everything else they did last year was in an effort to make it look like they were conducting a real coaching search. And then once the Josh McCown situation fell through because of the Brian Flores lawsuit, I don't think there was any way they were going to hire a white guy as their head coach, right? Like whether it was going to be Brian Flores or Lovie Smith or somebody else, I don't think they were going to hire a white guy after that had happened. So I don't know how legit of a candidate Jonathan Gannon was really was a season ago. Now, in terms of this year, if Jeremy Fowler's right and he's a legitimate candidate this coming offseason, then I'm okay with it. You could do a lot worse than Jonathan Gannon. He's not my first choice, and if we're being honest, he's not even my first choice of people currently on the Eagles staff. I'd rather have their offensive coordinator, Shane Steichen. The job that he's done with Jalen Hurts, making that guy the MVP frontrunner through 14 weeks of the NFL season when people weren't sure what type of quarterback he was going to be this year. I prefer Steichen. I prefer DeMeco Ryans, the guy that you talked about, but you could do a lot worse than Jonathan Gannon. If you told me that he's the guy who's going to end up taking this job, I'd be pretty happy with it.
So does this mean Lovie's a goner? If Jeremy Fowler's writing this and connecting the dots to Jonathan Gannon, does this mean Lovie's a goner at this point?
I think the one-win football season means Lovie Smith's a goner. I mean, they haven't played good football this year. For a good portion of the year, Lovie Smith's defense has been one of the worst units in football. And I understand they've had a stretch here or there where they've overachieved or they've played good defense, and there's a thing here or there you can point to about this defense in small stretches of the season. But for the most part, it's one of the worst defenses in football. It's as bad, if not worse, for different stretches than it was last year. Lovie's in charge of the defense. The team took a step back, And Lovie Smith doesn't have a lot of potential left in the conversation. Like if there was some unknown potential, some unknown facet of what Lovie Smith is as a head coach, if this was a first-year head coach, it'd be a lot easier to say, let's go ahead, year 2, let's give this guy another chance with another upgrade in the talent on the roster, with us spending some money, some significant money in free agency. Let's give this guy a chance. There's nothing left for Lovie Smith to prove. Lovie Smith has shown the best of what Lovie Smith has to offer, and frankly, that was in Chicago many years ago. Like, there's not a whole lot more for Lovie Smith to showcase as a head coach. If there was some unknown associated with the head coach right now, I'd be like, cool, bring him back. David Culley, there wasn't a lot of unknown with David Culley. I think that's part of the reason David Culley got fired. He messed up a lot of easy stuff, like from a game management standpoint. And he had the benefit of Nick Caserio in his headset telling him what to do, and he still messed stuff up. I think it's one of the reasons David Culley's out of here, and one of the big reasons Lovie Smith will be out of here is, hey, you took over a team, it got worse, there's not a lot left in your coaching career. Adios, see you later. Here's a big check on the way out the door.
I think there's a 100% chance Pep Hamilton is fired after this season. I think there's a 90% chance Lovie Smith is fired at the end of this season. There's a scenario in my mind where the Texans don't want to fire another coach, and they keep Lovie Smith around, but they completely change up the coaching staff under him, meaning they bring in a different offensive coordinator, but also they bring in a defensive coordinator to run the offense to where Lovie's just kind of a figurehead so they don't have to deal with the ramifications of firing a second coach in 2 years. I don't think that should be the case. Cody, I agree with everything you've just said. We've seen enough from Lovie Smith to know that he is not viable to be a head coach in the NFL in 2022. Nobody else interviewed this guy last year. Nobody thought about interviewing this guy last year, and yet here he is as the Texans head coach. So I think he should be gone. That would be my choice. We've seen enough from him, but there's still a little chance in my mind that the Texans would go that route to keep Lovie Smith around.
The tough part about what you brought up, BK, and look, I understand there is sort of a sliver of hope for Lovie Smith sticking around as the head coach of this organization just because the team would want the optics of firing two guys after one and done. The tough part is yes, the head coach wouldn't change, but the entire coaching staff would change. And if things didn't get significantly better again the next year, then you're firing the head coach and the entire coaching staff would change again. So at that point, you'd have, let's just use Derek Stingley and Jalen Petrie as an example. They'd be playing for 3 different defenses in 3 years. I don't like that. We talk about that with quarterbacks all the time. It's probably a little bit easier on defenders, on offensive linemen, on wide receivers. It's probably the most difficult on quarterbacks when they're learning a new offense every year. But damn, these guys are going to learn 3 new defenses in 3 years? Like, that's not a recipe for success. No. Like, turning over this coaching staff and keeping Lovie Smith, and then knowing that if he doesn't perform well and the team doesn't perform well, you've got to, again, turn that coaching staff over. And so you'd be going on, what, 4 coaching staffs in 5 years? Like, that is a recipe for disaster. That's why I like the clean sweep option from a coaching staff perspective. That's why I feel like most people believe the clean sweep option is the way to go. And you put it at 90%, I feel like that's a good percentage. And yeah, there is that little sliver that Lovie Smith hangs around, but you have to accept the risks that come with keeping Lovie Smith around. And that'd be yet again another coaching staff in 2024 if they fail in 2023.
Well, the thing this story doesn't mention is, how do we know Caserio's making this hire? It connects Caserio to Gannon. What if Cal McNair decides just to clean house, including the front office? Nick Caserio is 5-24-1 since he became the Texans GM. That's abysmal. So I wonder, is it definitely Nick that would make this decision? And just because they interviewed Gannon last year and Caserio maybe liked him, that doesn't mean that Gannon would make the most sense when you're going to have the first pick, and you might want to hire an offensive guy for Bryce Young or C.J. Stroud.
I'd love for them to talk to Gannon and about 15 other dudes. Talk to as many people as you. All it costs you is money and a little bit of time to talk to everybody. You find the right fit. But pick from the top. This organization, when the 2 most successful guys, Kubiak and O'Brien, they were 2 of the biggest names in the coaching cycle. And yes, I understand that the big name in the coaching cycle can sometimes fail. Look who's succeeding this year. Brian Daboll was one of the biggest names in the coaching cycle, and he was in the conversation for Coach of the Year for a good point. Now, the counterpoint to something like what I just talked about, well, the Eagles have Nick Sirianni. He was thought of as a huge reach. He turned out to be a really good coach. But more often than not, you look at the past 2 seasons of immediate improvement, okay, headed in the right direction, and knowing you're headed in the right direction, it's typically teams hiring from the top of the coaching cycle. And that is something that I feel like is imperative for the Texans in the offseason. Caserio or not Caserio at GM.
Yeah, and Jonathan Gannon's going to be at the top of the coaching cycle. He might not be number 1, but he's going to be up there. I mean, last year, he was interviewed by 3 different teams. This wasn't a Hines Ward situation. This wasn't a Josh McCown situation where the Texans were the only team to talk to this
Lombardi's grandson, who was the OC in L.A.
Yeah, Joe Lombardi?
I think it's Joe Lombardi.
Who's Rocky Lombardi?
Rocky Lombardi's old college coach, wasn't he?
Old quarterback at Michigan State. Then he transferred to Western Michigan. Nobody cares. Jonathan Gannon got interviewed by the Vikings and the Broncos last year. So this was not the Texans going out on a limb a season ago. This was a guy who was intriguing to other teams a season ago, and the Eagles' defense has gotten better this year. And, oh, by the way, Jonathan Gannon has already been through the gamut once, and that's generally how it works, where it takes a couple of cycles sometimes for guys to get hired as head coaches. They got to go through a couple of years or maybe 1 year's worth of interviews before they actually get hired. Gannon's been through this process. He knows what it's like. He's improved his qualifications with the job that he's done with the Eagles defense this season. You could do a whole hell of a lot worse than Jonathan Gannon once again. He wouldn't be my top choice, but I wouldn't be disappointed if he was the ultimate hire, especially if other teams talk to him again this offseason.
Because Fowler doesn't say anything about Casario's job status, does that give either of you any thought that Casario is safer than we have made him out to be?
I think he was always probably going to get a chance. I was just arguing, should he get a chance?
Sure. I mean, look, it's not out of the question that everybody gets a pink slip and they start over. That's not out of the question. I don't believe that to be the likely outcome.
I think the likely outcome is Casario does the unprecedented thing of getting to hire a third coach in 3 years.
Yeah, that feels like the most likely outcome. With Lovie Smith being shown the door, the majority of his staff, maybe the entire staff being shown the door. New coach comes in with Casario. They powwow, put together as good a staff as they can, and they try to get things going in year one. It's worth noting with the way they built this staff. I mean, they built this staff and sort of put it together for Josh McCown, and then Lovie had to pivot as the head coach and finish building it and putting together the rest of the thing. But we talked in the offseason that, hey, Pep was going to be the OC for McCown because they'd familiar with each other. Lovie's going to be the DC because they were familiar with each other. And then McCown's going to be like the help the offense CEO type coach that some of these coaches are. And, you know, they had to pivot to Lovie Smith, and they put together maybe a little bit different looking coaching staff. But those guys are probably all going to get shown the door. I would see very little reason to keep, you know, a lot of this staff, especially if a new guy's coming in, he's going to want to bring his guy.